Good morning, everyone. We are planning an international webinar on integrating risk into urban planning. The introductory remarks on Rebuild Kerala initiative will be done by Mrs. Sarada G. Muralidharan. 1990 batch IAS officer. He is presently Additional Chief Secretary, Government of Kerala, Local Self-Government Department. Headed Kudumbasri Mission of Government of Kerala for 6 years, and then went on to be the Chief Operating Officer at National Rural Livelihoods Mission of Ministry of Rural Development, Government of India. Mrs. Sharda was a Joint Secretary in the Ministry of Panchayat Raj, responsible for conceptualizing and promoting the GPDP, the Gram Panchayat Development Plans, that put a premium on citizens' participation through Gram Sabhas. While serving as the Director General of National Institute of Fashion Technology, restructured the curriculum and has anchored 4 strategic projects for sizing to trend, research, and design incubation. Ms. Sharada is spearheading a local self-government department in the Rebuild Kerala initiative, which will empower LSG to build resilience in disaster management. I welcome Ms. Sarada, Madam, to say the introductory remarks.
Thank you, Rajesh. So let me start with what the RKI is and why we have been going ahead with the Resilient Rebuild Kerala initiative. So, as you would probably know, in 2018, the state of Kerala was hit by the largest floods in living memory. When we say living memory, the only expression of floods of this nature, which impacted the entire state, go back over 100 years. And there are even today stories and myths that are around this flood, and the 2018 floods evoked memories of that. The 2018 floods, however, had come in, they were the impact of, they were unseasonal rains. They came at the fag end of the monsoon. We had big cloud bursts, and we had, of the 44 rivers, almost all of them got into spate, and things were very bad. It's a testimony to the resilience of the local communities. It is a testimony to the resilience of local communities that they could respond very quickly to the floods, get their act together, coordinate search and rescue operations, coordinate the rehabilitation process that happened after that. But the flood threw a lot of systemic issues into concern, and which is why the name itself came up. And the World Bank came forward with the initiative, with the support to the state of Kerala to tide over all the damage that had happened in the wake of the disaster, but also to come up with a partnership where we could look at rebuilding a Kerala that was resilient to disasters. When that project got going, the question also became as to whether shouldn't disaster resilience evolve into climate action and climate resilience as well. So that was that's the background of how this project came about. Multiple departments are involved. As far as the local self-government department is concerned, actually independent of this initiative itself, the local government department had come up with the idea of disaster management plans, which would be prepared and executed by local governments. And there was a logic to this. The rationale was that while the structure of disaster management authorities in the country and the state primarily look at the revenue and disaster management departments, the police and home departments, it was seen that, in the floods, the first responders were the local governments. in the floods, it was seen that the management of the shelters had to be supported by the local government. Had to be supported by the local governments. The action that was taken to clean up the water bodies, to ensure that the wells were clean, to detoxify places, to the cleansing operations in both households and community spaces. All of this again was spearheaded by local governments. So it was seen that the local governments had a major role to play, and therefore it was also felt that their understanding of what constituted disasters and how to deal with disasters needed to be harnessed on the one hand, but also to be developed on the other. So therefore, the local governments were asked and I need to mention that in Kerala, the local governments are extremely endowed. They are endowed with very substantive transfers, fiscal transfers by the state. They have their powers of generating their own revenues, but also they function as agency for the execution of various projects of various departments of the state. So be it health, education, social justice, civil supplies, industries, agriculture, livelihoods, animal husbandry, dairy. So in a multitude of areas, you will find that the local governments have a very important role to play. And this was, and they have also the resources at their disposal. This is, however, interesting to note that while the district management authorities have the responsibility of coming up with the disaster management plans, they do not have the kind of resources that are available to local governments. And it was seen that much of the development activity of the local governments could actually, by developing a disaster resilience focus, a climate resilient focus, could lead to handling sustainable development in a much better way, and also as a critical response to the times. So the local governments in 2019 December, there were instructions issued for the creation of these local government plans, and 29 digital maps had been prepared, and the boundaries drawn as per local governments and handed over to the concerned local governments. These plans gave us very interesting insight. So fairly good situation analysis was done, but we found that the local governments somehow there was a reluctance or an inability to convert this understanding of vulnerabilities, understanding of weather patterns that had evolved over times, understanding of natural resource management possibilities into action, into projects that, into a coherent action plan for climate action. However, we saw that all the segments that we were talking about were catered to in one form or the other, but not from the perspective of disaster management. So the disaster management plan and the way we were formatting them gave us some insights that we needed to work on. And this was the context in which the second phase of the Rebuild Kerala initiative came in which there are 2 DLIs which the state government is now anchoring in local self-government department. So one is the Disaster Climate Action Tracker, which looks at disasters and disaster management by the local government. It also looks at the climate resilient interventions by the local governments and evaluates where the local government stands on that. So it looks at the regulatory process, it looks at the development initiative, it looks at the people initiative and awareness building. And on that basis, it would evaluate exactly where the local government stands. In a sense, that would be a means of incentivizing local governments to perform, because if they meet the thresholds, they would be able to get some incentives. So the incentive is the carrot by which we are hoping to deepen the understanding of local governments as to how they do disaster and climate resilience. So that's the DCAT DLI. The other DLI is with regard to the risk-informed master plans. Kerala has had master plans, and many of our urban local governments already have created master plans. But then, as part of the first Rebuild Kerala initiative, the state also took upon itself the responsibility of creating a framework for risk information getting incorporated into the master plans. And interestingly, and this is something which is connected with the earlier DLI. So one part of that was also about, is it possible, given that the local government systems and their access to technologies and the internet is pretty significant, would it be possible for us to actually look at would it be possible for us to look at a localization of climate modeling? Could we look at local government specific climate models, which would be help the local governments plan better, project better, and prioritize better? And in that context, we also wanted to come up with risk-informed master plans in the state. So a broad framework had already been created by extensive revamp of the Act. But now came the challenge of coming up with the guidelines that would go into the nitty-gritty of the technical aspects of risk information, but also into the procedural aspects. And one big challenge there was the practicability of these plans. So while it would be the easiest thing, or not the easiest, but it would be the most straightforward thing, would be to create plans which would look at the scientific assessment of risk and the scientific assessment of possibilities. The world of politics on the ground and administration on the ground is not completely amenable to science. It requires a lot of positioning, negotiation, addressing the demands and the pulls and the pushes of various constituencies and interests that come into play in the local governance and the state government space, and of being able to accommodate them so that there is continuity and durability of governance. And so which means that there is a real politicking which needs to be done, incorporated into the planning system. Now, to what extent can we get the local elected bodies and the administrative functionaries to assimilate and understand the demands of these new technical aspects, which would go into risk information, and that would inform the way the master plans are prepared, and not just the master plans. From the master plans percolate into the interventions of the local governments by way of priority action plans, by way of entry into the annual and mid-term plans of the local governments. Ultimately, what we'd be saying is we'd tie up with the disaster climate action intervention that we are talking about. So bringing it all together is a very critical aspect. And in this context, we also have the idea of an urban observatory, which would help us to come into agile data governance by harnessing hyperlocal data that is around, and then also look at local data and thematic partnerships. So these are the interventions which are proposed under the RKI. And obviously our urban policy framework needs to be able to also become agile and accommodate the demands that will be thrown up on account of a process of this nature. With ultimately, so an urban policy that looks at sustainable development and adaptation to climate change, which is able to address the issues of digital divide and address that, looks at greenhousing, land use, etc., brings in the river basin and watershed approach into planning, helps the local governments think of not of themselves as isolated entities, but as a continuum, so that an urban local government works with a rural local government that is on its boundary all the way up the upstream to where of the river and downstream down to the sea. So that connect is made, and that thematic partnerships can be built up. That civic services from the water policy to waste policy and housing and disaster management policy, public health policy, all of these are fitted in And so that risk information, all of that is tied up well together. And these individual sub-policies come into the larger framework of urban policy. These are the multiple things that we are thinking of, which we are working on. It's not just about thought. We have come quite a bit of a way. And this webinar is primarily also to help us to keep moving forward and to keep fine-tuning the work that we are doing, improve, improvise, develop as we continue this journey to figure out how best we deal with the stupendous challenges that the reality of climate change has brought us to realize. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam, for giving an overview of the whole program. Disasters cannot be completely avoided, but vulnerability of people and assets to various hazards can be substantially and sustainably reduced by planned intervention, mitigation, and preparedness. The impacts of hazard on different regions vary based on numerous factors. In urban areas where there is concentration of people, establishments, and infrastructure, the damage caused by hazards could be manifold compared to the less developed areas. Unplanned developments and lack of investments in resilient infrastructure and services increases the likely disaster impact on the community. Disaster reduction measures is more effective and less costly than remedial measures. Integrating risk information to land use planning has the potential to reduce the impact of hazard on life, property, and environment of the community. Local self-government department is making guidelines for preparing risk-informed master plans for 10 urban local bodies in the Pamba, Manimala, Achengovil River Basin as an initial step under this initiative supported with external assistance. Risk information will be integrated into the master plan preparation process, and priority projects devolved from these plans will be considered for implementation. All the speakers in this webinar is one way or the other associated with this program. I invite Mr. Paul Guro for the next presentation. Paul Guro works in CERIMA, which is a French scientific and technical research center placed under the supervision of Ministry of Ecology and Sustainable Development, French government. Presently, he is also involved in supporting the preparation of guidelines for risk-informed master plans and urban planning in Kerala under the Rebuild Kerala initiative. Paul has over 15 years of experience as an engineer dealing with integrating flood risk reduction in urban planning. In this presentation, he will be talking about the tool developed called PPRI, equals Risk Prevention Plan, which is a dedicated tool for risk prevention and integration. Case study is on the second biggest city in France, Marseille. During the presentation, any questions is there, it can be put in the chat session. And finally, we will consolidate it and we will have 5 minutes for the question answer session. The presentation will be shared. Can you share the presentation, Paul? Let's see.
I just do last test, okay?
I'll do it from here.
Yeah, it doesn't work, so please do it from your computer if it's possible. Perfect. Can you show it in full screen? Is it possible for you? No, I think you have to go through maybe view, file, edit view on the menu. View. I think you have to click view.
View.
No,
menu option view.
Yeah, just before, yeah, view. And then full screen. Go down, bit down, full screen mode. Yes, thank you, Rajesh. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Rajesh, for inviting me to this webinar, because I'm really happy to present how we are dealing with this question of integrating risk into planning in France. And as well, I'm really looking forward to hear about other experience in India, Sri Lanka, United States. So thanks for having me with you today. I'm going to tell you a few words about one example, which is the flood risk prevention plan in Marseille, which is a city in the south of France, and I hope it will give you a good glimpse of what we are doing in France about this subject. Rajesh, if you, I will say next for next slide. Okay, next. Thank you, Rajesh. Rajesh told you that I was working in CEREMA, which is a technical and research centers depending on ecology ministries and the Ministry for Town Planning. This agency works in many fields. You have some of them in this slide. You see country planning, urban strategy, of course, climate change and energy transition, etc. And one of these fields is risk mitigation and resilience. And that's in this field in particular where I work. And in particular on the subject of flood risk prevention. Next, please. CEREMA is a big institution. We are almost 3,000 people working all over France, and we write as well a lot of guidelines and methodology. And we have we work both on national and local levels. So for more national government and local bodies, and I will show you a bit later how it's working here in France. So first, maybe what's important to understand is that integration of risk in land use planning is one part of a larger scheme of what is the French risk prevention policy, which you can see on this slide. And basically, you see it works as a circle. You see, we start with the first one, really important. We have to understand what are the risks on the territory. Then we move to number two. When we know that there are some risks, we have to know how to forecast them and to build early warning system, which is really important to see them coming on our territories. Number three, we have to put a lot of energy in bringing some education to the people that live in this territory, so they are aware that some phenomenon can happen. Number four, that's the one I'm going to talk today, integration of risk in land use planning. Number five, trying to reduce the existing vulnerability. So to put what we call mitigation measures to try to make things better than they were before. Number six, prepare and manage the crisis that will occur for sure. We know that when we speak about risk, we know that it's going to occur. We don't know when, we don't know how big it will be, but we are sure there will be a crisis someday. And the last step is 7, organize the feedback. Once you have the event, the flood is coming, you have to learn from this. You have to learn to understand the phenomena. You have to understand how the territory was struck, and this learning makes you able to make all the steps better. So when you're in number 7, you get back to number 1 and you try to improve again. Next, Rajesh, please. Even you can click twice. I lost Rajesh. Okay, you can. Okay, so this slide is really important, so you understand the global philosophy of risk prevention in France. And I show you this picture, this handshake symbology, because for me, it's the best way to understand how it works. You see, if you check at the right side in gray shows you that in France, we have this really generous and solidary compensation system, which is called CAPNAT. And this system ensures everybody to have a financial aid when there is a big risk event. So if you lose your car, if you lose your house, if you lose everything, you will get money from your insurance. It's compulsory. And this system, it is financed by everybody in France. And that's why I say it's a really solidary system, because everybody, when, for example, myself, I don't live in a flood-prone area, but if I want my car or my house to be insured, I will pay a certain amount of money. And from this amount of money, the state will take 12%. For example, if I pay 100 euro, they will take 12 euros, and they put this in a big cash pot that will be used to finance prevention. Okay, so even if I don't live in a risk-prone area, I will pay for the damages of the people that live in risk-prone area. So it's really a typical. I know this system is not everywhere in the world. In France, that's how it works. Everybody will be protected and will get money if they have problem with risk. So that's the right side of the handshake. But if we want this system to be working through the years, we have to do what is in the left side. You see, if we want that the vulnerability to risk doesn't explode, we have to do some risk prevention. That's how it works. So, and among those tools, we have to do some really detailed integration of risk into urban planning. Because if there is too much people building new houses in the risk-prone area, then we won't have enough money to finance our generous and solidary compensation system. That's how it works, and that's why you have to understand that it's a deal. Okay, that's the handshaking symbology. Next, please, Rajesh. And before I get to the detail of integration in the urban planning, I just want you to understand how French institutions are working. So on one side, we have a central government, and that's at this scale that we have the different ministries, among them Ministry of Ecology. And on the other side, next slide, please, we have some local authorities, local bodies. So the territory is divided in 12 regions. Next, Rajesh, please. These 12 regions are divided, Rajesh, please, next slide. They are divided in what we call departments, that you could call counties. And then, next, please. These departments are divided into municipalities or intercommunalities. So next slide, please. On one side, we have the central government, and that's the central government which is basically in charge with risk prevention plans. And on the other side, we have the local authorities, local bodies, who are in charge with urban planning. So I show you these two different systems so you understand that integrating risk into urban planning is at a crossover between central government responsibility and local authorities responsibilities. And it's important to understand that, because you will see it can sometimes be a bit problematic. Next slide, please, Rajesh. So my presentation today focuses on one thing, which is a risk prevention plan. In French, it's called Plan de prévention des risques inondations. The acronym is PPRI. So you will see this PPRI many times in my slides. In my slides, sorry. So you please understand that PPRI stands for Risk Prevention Plan. So what is this document? Basically, it's made with three main pieces. There is a presentation book, which is a written document that explains why we do a PPRI and how it is done, and two main pieces, which are the two important pieces. There is a regulating zoning. So basically, it's a map with different kind of risk, and then attached to this map, there is a regulation book that will tell people what is forbidden and what is allowed, and if it is allowed, what conditions should be applied. Really important, this plan, it's elaborated and approved by the central government, okay? Central government, but it has to be discussed and worked in really close approach with the local bodies which are in charge of the urban planning. So it's the central government who is elaborating the plan, but central government has to talk and to exchange in detail with the local bodies. Of course, the inhabitants of the floodplains, the people that live there, they have to be associated as well. And those two things, speaking with the local municipalities and associating the inhabitants of the floodplain, it's an obligation that was written in the law not that long ago. It was, I think, 2008. Because before that, it was just the central government that was doing the plan, and it was a bit brutal in the sense that they were just doing the plan technical way, and they were applying this, and it was difficult for the local bodies to make those plans applicable. Next, Rajesh, please. So to explain to you how we are doing the risk prevention plan, I just get back to our definition of risk, because I know sometimes risk is not defined the same in all parts of the world. So in France, we consider that risk is defined as the intersection between the hazard, okay, so in our case, the flood hazard, so the description of the flood-prone area associated with a given return period. And so we do the intersection between hazard and what we call stakes, and stakes describe how the territory is composed. I mean, are you in an urbanized area? Are you in a natural area? Do you have a communication network, etc., etc.? So basically, you have to check the hazard, the stakes, and you cross them to define the risk. And what's important to understand is that a huge flood that strikes an empty area is not considered as a risk. It's just water coming, no damages, water coming back. So risk appears when water comes to a dense and built area. Next, please. And this articulation helps us understand how we're going to build the risk prevention plan. Step one, we do a map of the hazard. Then step two, we define what are the stakes. Step three, we cross those two data to do the risk map, which is used to build the regulation zoning. And then last step, an important step, step four, is writing the regulation rules that come along with the map. Next, please. So my example, how I'm going to show you is, I'm going from this example of Marseille risk prevention plan. Marseille is the second biggest city in France. It's in the south of France, as you can see on the map. And it is crossed by a river named Uvonne. It's Uvonne River, which is quite a small river, as its watershed is only 500 square kilometers. And this watershed goes through 27 municipalities, which is approximately 1 million people living in this watershed. So it's not that huge compared to big river. Maybe you have experience in Kerala, but still, if you go next, next please, Rajesh. This is a really small river. You see it on the picture here. And it's typical from our area in south of France. It's really a low flow most of the time of the year. You see, it's a really small river, but it can be subject to really important flash floods, mostly during the fall season. And these floods can be really sudden and violent. And just to give you an idea, in Marseille, we have approx 50,000 inhabitants and almost 40,000 jobs impacted by these floodings in this city, just to give you an idea. So why do we do a risk prevention plan in Marseille? It's quite easy. It's because this territory has been already damaged by very big floods in the past, and this many times. But it's important, this territory didn't see any big floods for a long time now. Because as you can see on this time scale, you see I put the big dates are the last big floods, and you can see that the last one is 1978, so it's quite old now. And people that live in Marseille, they most of them, they forgot that they live next to a river that can that can produce flooding. So it's really important to make those people remember they live in a flood-prone area. I think it's really in Kerala, and in the introduction we heard about all the rebuild Kerala question. It's not a big problem for you because you had those big events. Back in France, in some parts, we didn't have big events for a long time, so we have to reactivate the flood memory. Thanks, you can go next. So first step I told you for the risk prevention plan is to build what we call the hazard map. And for this, we run hazard studies that are really important. They are made at a watershed scale. It's not a little part of the river we're studying. We're studying the whole river and its whole watershed. These studies, basically, they are always made the same. We do historical data analysis, field survey, of course, really important field survey. We have to get topographic data like DEM. Most of the time now it's made by plane or drones. It's LIDAR DEM. And then with this data, we run some hydrological and hydraulic simulations that will give us, that will allow us to understand how the floodings will occur. And all this has to, the conclusion of this work is to have a map of the flood-prone area. Next, please, Rashesh. And you have here an example of what kind of maps we are targeting. So here you can see for a part of Marseille, you can see a flood-prone area for a 10 years return period flood, which means 1 in 10 chance that the flood occurs in 1 year. Okay, it's a probabilistic definition. Okay, every year there is 0.1 chance that a probability that this flood will occur. And you see the blue colors. When the blue is darker, it means there is more water. And H stands for the water depth here. Then if you go next, you will see same area, but this time it is the 50 years return period. So you see that the flood-prone area gets wider. And then again, Rajesh, 100 years return period, and then again 1,000 years. So basically, when we run this kind of studies, we don't just map one flood. We try to see how are the different kind of events that can strike the territory. If you go next, Rajesh, please. So you see that we have different floods, but for the risk prevention plan, we pick only one, and we pick the flood which is called reference flood scenario. So it's the level on which lays the regulatory zoning that you will see later on, and it is defined as the biggest event between the highest historical flood, or if you don't have big historical flood on this territory, it will be the 100 years return period flood. That's how we define. So it means when we do integration of risk in urban planning, we are targeting this basically 100 years return period flood. That's the level we are looking at. When you have this simulation, then you can do a hazard qualification with the matrix you have on the right side up. You see, you look at the height, water height, and water speed, and from those two parameters, you will say if you are in a moderate or high hazard categorization, and you can build what we call the hazard map. That's the one you have under your eyes, and it shows the different kind of hazard, and it shows numbers as well. You see on my example, you see 63.76. That's the water level altitude. So you know that for this reference flood, the water will get as high as 63.76 meters above the sea level. That's an altitude, okay? If you go next. Okay, I just do a small intervention about a subject which was not in Marseille, but which is really important in France. It's the question of the flood protection dikes. Many floodable territories, they are protected by dikes. But in France, when we do integration of risk into urban planning, we consider that these dikes may break. It's really important. That's what you see on this small picture. And unfortunately, all the big events have shown in history that at some point there is a flood big enough to break the dike, or maybe even to go above the dike. So next slide, please, Rajesh. So we take as a principle that it's totally impossible to say that a protection system will never fail. It's impossible. And the hazard will be really high just behind the dike if it breaks, because that's a place where you get really high velocities and really brutal flooding in places where people think they are protected. So it's, for prevention, really difficult, because these people, they are used to see the dike and they say, okay, no problem, because there is this huge infrastructure that is protecting me, so I have no problem. But if it breaks, now it's really big problem. So when we do our hydraulic simulation, we do some transparency hypotheses, which are really important. And we take as a principle that building a protection cannot be a tool for urban planning. Building a protection is good for protecting people that already live in the flood prone area, but it should not be an excuse to put even more people in this flood area. Just an illustration next. Okay, so here it's a place in France next to a really big river in France, which is called Rhône River. And you see on the left, that's the flood prone map in a situation without protection system. And on the right, it's the new situation when they built dikes and protection system. So you see there is a huge difference. But if you just click next, Ravesh, if you, for the PPRE, for the risk prevention plan, we will take the left map. It's really important. And even if the dikes were really, how do you say, it costs a lot of money to build those dikes. When you speak about integrating into urban planning, you pretend they do not exist. It's really important. Next, please, Ravesh. So I get to step 2. Okay, step 1 was hazard. Step 2 is stakes maps. And as I told you, stakes map, building this map is like dividing the territory into 3 kinds of urbanization types or urbanization levels. Okay, on one hand, you have what we call non-urbanized area, which are basically natural or agricultural areas. And on the other hand, we have urbanized area, in which we do the distinction between city centers, which are easy to understand. It's the historical city centers with a big diversity of usages, density, continuity in building patterns. So, okay, that's the idea we have about city centers. And then the rest of the urbanized area, which is called ordinary urbanized area. Okay, so just show you a few examples. Here it's in Marseille. So if you see at the satellite image, you see we are in the city, but this small part that I show you on the green screen is a non-urbanized place in the big city. Okay, so this will be in green. Next slide. Here it's an example of a place. There is no doubt it is urbanized places, but you see the density is not that huge. We can see many trees. It's only small individual houses. So it's not really a city center. And then next slide. This example is a city center. You see that there are some biggest building, and you in this part at the I can't show you with my mouse, but at the north of the image there is a train station. There are some shops. So this is really an example of French city center. Okay, so next step. So we did step 1 hazard, step 2 we defined the urbanization level, and then we get to the most important part, which is step 3, meaning building the flood risk regularity zoning. And if you have to remember one thing from our way of doing things in France, is this blue and red matrix, really important. And I will explain to you because these matrix show the main principles. Okay, so next slide, please, Rajesh. First principle, just before I explain to you, so the matrix you see on the left side, you have moderate hazard and high hazard. So it's the qualification of hazard. And then first line, you have the type of urbanization, okay? Non-urbanized, ordinary urbanized, and city center. And when you cross these two categories, the matrix shows if you are, please get back to the first one, thanks. And the matrix is red for the places that should be no building permit zone, so it's impossible to build new houses, and blue are the sector where it's possible to build, okay? So first principle, it should not be allowed to build in places of high danger, meaning where the hazard is high, okay? So that's the three red, the three red at the bottom, okay? Next slide. We should not implant new vulnerability in flood-prone areas which are not urbanized. And this is really important to understand, because this sector, which are non-urbanized today but floodable, that's where the water will expand during the flood. And it's because water goes here that it won't go more in the city center and in the urbanized area. So what does it mean? It means that even in moderate hazard places, even, for example, in sector that you have almost, I don't know, only 10 centimeters of water, in these places, if it's non-urbanized today, it should not be urbanized tomorrow. And it's really, really important. Next principle, in city center, you know, it's the place where it's already really dense and it's the heart of the urban zone. You should be allowed to go through the finite densification, even if you are in high hazard, because anyway, the city center, it has to be dense. So if there is only a small empty pockets, you are allowed to fulfill densification on this spot. And last principle, which is quite important as well. So you see that in the urbanized zone, even in high hazard, then you will be allowed to do what we call urban renewal projects. So maybe in some places we call it urban regeneration project. At one condition is that this urban project helps to reduce flood vulnerability. So if you go next slide, this question of on the condition they reduce flood vulnerability, if you go just before, thanks. What does it mean? It means that we have to run a precise and detailed flood vulnerability analysis conducted based on the comparison between the initial situation, how is the city today and how it will be tomorrow. And it should allow you to answer the question, will this urban renewal project allow to reduce the vulnerability of the area? Will it help to improve resilience to flood? And to go through this analysis, you have to ask you this kind of question. How many people are living in the flood-prone area? Before, after? How many people are living in the flood-prone area under the flood level? Before, after? Will the different networks will be more resilient, like electricity, gas, etc. Like during the flood, will the buildings still be plugged with the electricity? How is the crisis management prepared? How the people that live in those projects, are they informed about the risk and how do they cope with that? So all these kind of questions. Next slide, please, Rajesh. And this question, this analysis, it's important that it is run at a large scale. It should not be run at a single piece of land scale. It should be run at the scale of an entire neighborhood, because if you go just next slide, you see you have to think about how this neighborhood is working in normal time, and then how it works with the water, with the flood. and you have to understand how this will connect with the rest of the city. So it should be run really at a large scale, and it should be run by a public actor, because like the local bodies, that's the actor that's in charge with this question of making the city work properly. So I get back to my blue and red matrix. As I told you, that's I think a really important point. And so blue and red give you the general prevention principle, but still it's important to understand that there are some exceptions in those rules. For example, in the blue zone, I told you it's the places where you are allowed to build your building, but still in this place, some buildings will be forbidden, like schools, hospital, crisis manager, crisis command center, like police, fire brigade, etc. Because that's this kind of building, we don't want to see this in the flood area. And on the other hand, I told you that red was the no building permit area, but still some construction are still allowed in there. For example, I told you that in the non-urbanized area in moderate hazard, we should be in red zone to prevent risk, but still in these places that as they are agricultural, they are used for agriculture, it's important that people that do agriculture there, maybe they can build some new building so they can make their business going up. So it's important. Next slide, please, Rajesh. So I just get back so you understand well, okay? Step one, and this is an example here in Marseille. Step one, you do the hazard map. It looks like this. Step two, if you go next, you do the stakes maps. So you remember, you divide depending on the urbanization level. And step three, you cross those two information to build what we call the regularity zoning. So it's this map, and depending on the risk level. And that's with this map that we will write the rules. So next slide, just to show you, if we zoom out, that's at Marseille scale. You see that there are many areas which are concerned by the plan, and many of them are red. So in these red zones, it means we should stop urbanization. No more urbanization in this kind of sectors to prevent that risk get higher and higher. So I told you, last step is when you get your map, you have to write the rules that goes, the rules that go along with the map. And I'll try to be quick because I guess my time will soon be finished. The rules, so we call it règlement, which is a written rules document, is divided into two main parts. The first part, which is the main part, I'd say, is the rules. It concerns the rules that a project holder has to respect when he wants to build something. Okay, he wants to build a new house, or he wants maybe to do a modification on some existing buildings. And so he has to check in which zone he is. You see, it's written depending on the zoning, red, blue, light blue, etc., etc. And then from the rules, you will see what is allowed and what is not allowed. And you have to follow precisely the rules. And of course, local authorities will have to check that those rules are well applied. So if you go next step, I have no time to go in detail through an example of rules because those documents are really dense. For example, please go back, please, Rajesh. I just want to show you one of the main rules, which in my point of view is really important, simple and important, is that in the flood area, you have to write rules that will oblige people to build the first floor of the new building higher than the water elevation for the 100 years return period. So this is a scheme, but if you go next, Rajesh, you will see how it can look. Can you go next, please? Okay, so it looks like this in real life. You see, you can imagine some nice architecture principle that will help you elevating some building. And just next picture is interesting because it's the same building, but in some flood situation. And you can see that the streets around the building are, there is a bit of water, not that much, but you can see on the picture that it's still possible to live in the building. You see there is a man on the left in front of his door. If you go on the right, first story, you see that there is light in the building. So it means electricity is still going to this building. So it was designed so the networks are still working during the flood. So this is an example of how the rules should be transformed into real building on the field. That's what I wanted to show you. And next, I just give you a few words about what is the second part of the rules of the risk prevention plan, because I think it's quite typical from France as well. There is a second part that will speak about mitigation measures that should be implemented for reducing vulnerability of the building that already existed at the time the plan was approved. Okay, because for example in Marseille the plan was approved in 2017, I think, but before that there were already many buildings and people living in this flood-prone area. So that's why the prevention plan tries to make this situation better. So what are the mitigation measures? For example, that's what you see on the picture on the top. It's like putting what we call flood barriers that will prevent the water coming into the building. So if it's a flash flood that don't last many hours, it will prevent the water from going, and then it will prevent the damages inside the house, which is really nice. Other kind of mitigation measure, for example, building, if you just can go back, Rajesh, it's like building what we call safe room. For example, if you check the house on the bottom right, you see first it was only the white house, which was a ground house without any story. And then the PPRE tells it's compulsory to build a safe room above the level of water, a room where people will be safe waiting for the flood to finish. And it's really important to understand that if the plan makes those measures compulsory, then it has to be applied under 5 years. So it has to be done by the owner of the house. So it's really important. So it costs money. But if it's compulsory, then it can be financed by the state up to 80% of the amount of the work. Okay. And there is like a securities threshold, like if the cost of these works is greater than 10% of the estate value, then it's not compulsory. Okay, it was a choice for that the prevention plan do not oblige people to spend too much money. That was the idea. But even if it's financed, and even if sometimes it's not compulsory, it's not always done. And I have to admit that France is not that good on checking if these mitigation measures are effectively done. Okay, next step, and I will be finished soon. I told you at the beginning that this prevention plan, they should be done with information toward the population that lives in those areas. So when we do these plans, we do a lot of public meetings and exhibitions, and all the documents, they are shown on the internet and in the municipality city hall. But still, with all these efforts, it's really difficult to gain inhabitants' attention. And just to give you an example, I told you in Marseille, it was about 50,000 people in the flood-prone area. And we did a lot of public meetings to inform the people. And with all this meeting, we only spoke to 500 people. So 500 people on 50,000 people. So just to show you, it's really difficult to make people interested in this subject. Our risk prevention plan are sometimes difficult to build. Just to give you an idea, in Marseille, this is sorry because it's not translated, but you get the point. It's the time scale for the elaboration of the risk prevention plan. So you see it started in January 2011 and it finished in February 2017. So it took 6 years. To be approved. So it's really long time. And as well, this risk prevention plan it's not always easy to build because as you can guess, risk prevention and urban development can sometimes appear as really incompatible goals. And central government, you remember, in charge of risk prevention, and local authorities, which are in charge of urban planning, sometimes they can oppose quite roughly. You can find technical controversies as well, because you know, when you speak about hydraulic simulation, it's not like I mean, if you ask two different engineers to build their map won't be exactly the same. So sometimes there are some controversy about which map should be taken. And as well, we can encounter high political contestation because like the local bodies, elected people, they don't want their territory to be impacted by this restriction of urbanization, and as well, high opposition from the population. And sometimes some of our risk prevention plan, they go through court because some people go through legal appeals to try to break them so they can disappear. So as a conclusion, I will tell you that I think we are lucky in France to have this tool, this PPRI, which is a risk prevention plan. It's a dedicated tool which has been imagined and implemented into the law just for integrating risk into urban planning. So we are lucky to have this, but still it's important to understand that it's not a magic tool, and it's I don't want to make you believe it solves all the problem, because it's not true. As I told you, it's technically complex sometimes, it's a long process, and it can sometimes produce a high contestation and opposition. And to be honest, it's more efficient for future urbanization than for existing, for mitigation measures. I told you about reducing existing vulnerability. So, and it will be my last slide. I think it's really, really important to keep in mind that integrating risk into urban planning is really important, but it should be a part of a larger scheme. And I show you again this picture you see, I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. I mean, energy should be put on every one of those 7 components. And I think it should be the same everywhere. And second point, integrating risk into urban planning also lays on non-regulated tools, because my risk prevention plan, you understood, it's a regulatory tools, okay? It's the law, and then you have to implement this urban plan, respect the rules, etc., etc. But it's not the only thing you can do, because as well you can do some other things, like, for example, for me, really important, you have to run risk education program to the population. So the people that would live in these urbanized areas, they will know about the risk, and they will know how to act the day the flood will come. So it's really important. And as well, I think there is a huge role to play by be played by the how you call them, the professionals, people, the urbanists, architects, engineers that should inject innovative solution in urban project. What I mean is, it's not only rules to respect, but as well it should. I mean, if you want to do some risk integration into urban planning, you have to have people that gives you innovative solutions so you can reach this aim. That's it. And sorry if I was a bit long.
Thank you, Paul. It was really informative, and the whole process has been described very elaborately. And we are very happy that we have a good session. We have a few questions are there. Basically, is this fluvial flooding or pluvial flooding that is being simulated? And what is the spatial resolution at which the modeling is done?
Okay, so about this example I showed you was about fluvial flooding. It's about this river I showed you, Ribbon River. And we didn't run a pluvial flooding. It will be actually the studies are running now, but we still don't have the results. So it depends on the territory. If in your territory, I mean, the main subject is fluvial flooding, you should put all your effort on this first, and then you go to the other kind of hazards. Okay. Spatial resolution, basically we use the 1 meter LIDAR DEN, and then the hydraulic simulation is run so its result can be used for a 1 on 5,000 zoom resolution, because that's sorry, I lost the name in English. That's the resolution we use for our risk prevention plan.
Yeah, two more questions. Whether are the stormwater drains and subways considered in this modeling? And what is the block of regulation? It is cadastral level regulation that is being done?
So about the stormwater drains, no, they are not taken into account for mainly two reasons, I guess. First one is that, you know, as I told you, we are speaking about 100 years return period events, and basically in south of France, the stormwater system, drains or subways, they are developed for basically 5 to 10 years return period. So for a big events like a 100 years return period, this system they do nothing. There is no difference if we take this into account or not. So that's why it was not. And a second answer.
For regulation, yes. This is the cadastral level that's being used.
Yeah, exactly. It should be possible to apply our plan to every cadastral parcel.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
We go on to the, we have a little extended our time limit, but it's okay. We will, the earlier questions was raised by Mr. Shekhar Kuriakos, Dr. Shekhar Kuriakos, Member Secretary, Kerala State Disaster Management Authority. Next speaker is Mr. Jerry Chen. He's a senior urban economist and sector coordinator of urban infrastructure development in the World Bank, currently based in Singapore. Mr. Chen is nearly 20 years of experience, and for the past 15 years, he has been working with the World Bank. He currently leads the World Bank investment, lending, and urban policy reform advisory work in India and Bangladesh, and previously in Sri Lanka, Vietnam, and Tanzania. Mr. Chen is involved in various areas, including urban planning and regeneration, urban transport and land use planning, municipal infrastructure and service deliveries, metropolitan governance and strategy. He holds a degree in municipal engineering, urban planning and regional economics from Tongji University, China, and Massachusetts Institute of Technology, USA. He will talk about the urban transformation process in Metropolitan Colombo region in Sri Lanka, started in 2011, and using the urban flood management as an entry point. The presentation will briefly analyze the key ingredients to this success of the transformation and how government formulated an interesting strategy, integrated strategy with World Bank support for past decade. Over to Mr. Jerry. Thank you.
Hi, Rajesh. Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. Very honored to be invited to join. Let me share my screen first. Okay, first just to check, Rajesh, can you see my screen?
You can see your presentation. You can switch on to that mode which Mirash has earlier mentioned.
1 second.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
Okay, good. How many minutes do I have? Rajesh?
25 minutes. 25 minutes.
Okay. Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks again for inviting me to this webinar, international webinar on integrated risk into urban planning. So for today's discussion, I would just like to share briefly some other experience from Sri Lanka, specifically from the Colombo region, metropolitan region, which has been sort of under implementation for the past decade, and the World Bank was sort of very much involved in providing support to the government in that area. So I will talk, I think given the limited time, I won't be able to sort of go into a lot of details. I will try to touch upon the role of risk planning, because I think that's the topic for today's event. But I think I will also try to give the participants a broader view of how planning and visioning was part of a broader urban transformation process, and how that transformation was implemented step by step. And I think that will be a sort of a kind of from our side, an important sort of takeaway for this. So I think my challenge is basically to use the next 10 minutes to tell a 10-year sort of transformation process, which means I won't go into sort of details on a lot of things. I will give a snapshot, a view of how this process started and developed. Let me start by saying 4 key points. Again, I won't go into every point in detail, but I think these are the key points for takeaway, for which is important key ingredients for a success, in the transformation process. The first point is that grand vision from the highest level is needed for this scale of development and transformation. The second point is you need to have very strong execution capacity. After you have the vision, you have the plan. So there should be a willingness and ability to implement the plan and the projects. So that's also important. The third point, I think more related with today's topic, is integrated planning. Of course, considering the risk factor, and then the desire to use the cutting edge design. And the last point is close institutional collaboration, and a lot of that will need to be across city level or across ministry or agency or department level. For the work we're talking about, probably it's very difficult to have everything done under one single city or department or agency. Therefore, institutional coordination is very critical. So this is sort of a big flooding event occurred in Colombo region in 2009, when the city, the country came out of a decades-long civil conflict. This reminds me of the similar event in Kerala in a couple of years ago in 2018. And the picture shows, actually, this is a picture of Sri Lanka's parliament building, which is in Battaramulla area, which is essentially in the very core part of the metropolitan area. So during that week, the entire parliament was quite heavily flooded. And from the World Bank side, we in 2009, 2010, we actually had not engaged in the urban development area for nearly 10 years. So it was a critical time for us to re-engage and provide our support to the government back then. So the question is, we need to start from somewhere. And the question, after a lot of discussion, there was a decision reached at that time between with the government of Sri Lanka, essentially to use the urban flooding management as an entry point for first wave of redevelopment and therefore the support from the bank side. And the idea is, as the government works on address the urban flooding management issues, they will also like to take on and look at the broader urban development and metropolitan development aspects, which I mentioned at the beginning. So use the urban flood to stimulate broader transformation, which the government really desired at the time. As a result, we prepared a Metro Colombo Urban Development Project, MCUDP, in 2010 with total World Bank funding of $225 million US. And actually the project just completed this year. So it's nearly a 12 years engagement experience. So before we sort of get into the project mode, at the initial stage, there was a lot of planning and preparation work needed. I think different techniques were used. I won't go into technical details, but I think 2 points I like to mention here. The first point is, naturally, there is a need to go beyond municipal administrative boundaries and to look at the entire Metro Colombo water basin, which is around a little bit more than 100 square kilometers. So that includes, administratively, that includes 7 local municipalities that is included in this water basin. Because that way we can look at the metropolitan flooding issue in a more sort of coherent, integrated manner. And the second point here is, as we were preparing for the project, we actually, as we update the rainfall data, was quite interesting to see through the data that the changing dynamics of the rainfall intensity as a result of climate change. So what used to be a 50-year return period event, say 5 years ago, at the time we were preparing the project, it already became a 30-year return period event. So the intensity of extreme weather events happening has already started. And actually, I don't have the latest data, but it'll be interesting to see after nearly 10 years whether this pattern has sort of continued. No? Then, before going to the planning, I think you need to have an overall strategy which sort of oversees the planning process. And when it comes to the flooding management in the Colombo water basin area, I think at the time we had a very kind of clear strategy, which is kind of reflected in this diagram I'm showing. And actually, this diagram worked out very well with not only with technical people, but with a lot of politicians that we need to consult with at the time, and with a lot of communities. And the idea is that if you look at from the blue circle, right? So that's sort of the like the upper stream of where the water is flowing from. Then to the middle part, which is in the orange circle, and then to the downstream part close to the Indian Ocean front is showing in the yellow part. So the strategy is very simple. That is in the upstream, we should try to divert meaning we create diversion channels from the metropolitans to the two sides, which is through here and through here. So not too much water will be coming into the Colombo water basin, okay? So there should be investment designed in their area to divert the water. So next, once the water comes into the Colombo water basin, which is essentially the core part of metropolitan area and where the parliament building that I showed was is located, no? The strategy should be to retain, meaning we need to create a lot of retention capacities to retain the water, then so that the water will not sort of flush into the downstream, which is where Colombo city, the CBD part of the most commercial part of metropolitan is located. No, so that retain is the strategy for the middle part. And once the water, come to the downstream part where it's more commercially densely populated, the strategy is to discharge. So we create outlet capacity and functionality, so the water gets out to the seaside more rapidly. So divert, retain, and discharge in 3 different parts of the metropolitan and 3 different stages of flood management. So that's an overarching kind of strategy that we sort of help the government come up with at the time. Using this strategy, as we translate that into a investment planning, of course, there's a lot of hydraulic model and hydraulic planning behind this map, but essentially this is sort of the outcome of the planning process and a lot of community consultation that lasted for nearly 2 years, 1.5 years to 2 years. And the result is a list of investment packages, more than 30 investment packages, totally $180 million. I think at the end, it was, it ended up being higher than that, consisting of macro drains, micro drains, pumping stations, tunnels, outlets, and all the natural-based solution activities. And also was a comprehensive packages of a lot of civil, hard, and soft infrastructure projects, which later on were implemented throughout a time horizon of nearly 10 years that I mentioned. So without going to details, I thought I would just maybe put some picture just to give you some visuals of what was happened. And apologies, these are slightly old, outdated pictures from maybe 2 years ago. Now, most of all of these works have been completed. So this is one of the big tunnel, New Motwa Tunnel in Colombo, which was constructed to play an important connector role for as part of the drainage, macro drainage system. And this is, again, for the new Motwa Tunnel construction site at the time, a couple of years ago. Now it's all completed. This is close to the seaside. This is another important tunnel, Torrington Tunnel construction site, which was a missing link as part of the hydraulic system and outlet structure of the Torrington Tunnel. So this was the last civil works package under the project, which was just finishing the completion a couple months ago. This is some of the pumping stations that was financed and constructed. I want to also talk a little bit about how, as I mentioned at the beginning, while the urban flooding issue is being addressed, how to stimulate the broader urban transformation process in the Metro Colombo region. So one thing, interesting to see, and I think it's probably a little bit similar to Kerala or some part of Kerala, is there are a lot of wetlands, canals and wetlands within the Colombo metro region. Actually, some of these pictures are just a couple of 100 meters away from the Parliament building. So essentially the core part of Metropolitan is essentially surrounded by wetlands, and the system of canals. However, these wetlands have a lot of challenging realities because people are encroaching. There's high pressure for development and redevelopment and dumping of the waste, construction materials, things like that. Because a lot of these wetlands and areas, waterfront space are not really being managed very well. There's not a very clear sort of roles and responsibility in some of these areas. And at the time, there was a lot of debate and pressure for, on one side, there's a lot of, plan for reuse these wetland resources, convert them to development or to parks, to municipal parks, on the other side, there's a lot of voice in how can we preserve these wetland resources, because it also has a contributing factor for the urban flooding issue. So just to remind the audience, a lot of these wetlands are in the middle part of the Metropolitan. So if you recall the three-part strategy, this is the part where strategy-wise, we really need to retain the water. So in a way, these wetland resources, if preserved well, can really contributing to the retention capacity of the whole system. And again, we sort of came in from the integrated planning process, because as we look at and analyze these wetland resources, we feel that's actually a much broader system than we could actually see from the ground. And it connects different parks and different urban centers and different cultural heritage assets that are actually very close to these rivers, and a lot of biodiversity areas. And on this map, if you see in the middle of this system is actually the Parliament building of Sri Lanka. So I don't know whether you can see the mouse I'm sort of showing. So this is the one area we actually decided to invest under the project. And later on, the government really took it up and used a similar approach to cover sort of different parts of the wetland system, wetland resources as part of the system. And here talks about, I think touches upon the issue of visioning. At the time we were doing the planning for the canal and for the wetland resource. We showed this map to the government at the time, which is the, I think some of you will be familiar in the case of Boston in the US, the Emerald Necklace, which essentially is a system of parks, designed by the famous architect who designed the Central Park in New York City. So I think at the time, the government really took it up and would like to benchmark their own activity against the world-class planning and ecosystem, park system case. So that's sort of the kind of target they were aiming at in terms, not only in terms of planning, but also in terms of the quality of works. So again, cannot show too many details, but just a few pictures of the completed works. Was very minimal sort of intervention because this is very highly ecologically sensitive part of the city. The name of the park is called Bedagana. So if some of you want to Google it later on, as if you Google Bedagana Biodiversity Park, you can find a lot of interesting pictures and articles, Facebook pages. This is in some of the park area. This is one of the photo shoot we had in one of the evenings. It's actually very quiet and peaceful, but maybe 500 meters away, it's very busy traffic, noisy traffic. And actually, as we were developing this, we hired wetland experts from UK Conservation Fund, who the team came and really did a very in-depth analysis. Was interesting to see. The area has very rich biodiversity resources, and actually talking about bird watching. So they were very interested. They were saying actually it's a very nice location in Southeast Asia for bird watching, just given the diversity of species of birds, either from the area or migrating birds. And also, I think it's not only about constructing the infrastructure, but also about operation and maintenance and management of the area after the completion. So that we spent a lot of time working with the government, which finally was up running, and they organized very interesting programs for different groups. So this became a very, not only for tourists now, but also for a lot of schools. They organized a youth education program. So they visited, they organized tours education program for the school children to come and learn about biodiversity. This is another example. It's not a wetland park. This is a municipal park, Vihamahadevi Park, which is right in front of the Colombo Municipal Town Hall building. Again, if you can see my pointer, this is the Colombo Municipal Town Hall, and across the street, this is the municipal park. So it was very kind of old, rundown, and very outdated facilities. So the project upgraded the entire park and the drainage system around the park and the lighting system in and around the park. And what was kind of interesting is we designed the park in a way it served as a municipal park in normal times, but when extreme weather events happen, meaning when the high intensity rainfall as well as high tide, high river tide, both events happen, it's very sort of difficult for the system to manage. In those circumstances, this big municipal park can actually turn into a retention space, to retain more water, so they don't bring additional pressure to the drainage system. So actually, it did happen in one of the events a couple of years ago when heavy rain happens. This whole municipal park was flooded, and I remember. Some news article was criticizing, after all this water investment, this whole park was flooded. And then we had to really, government actually came out and say, that was exactly the purpose of the design, is to convert this park to be a retention area when extreme weather events happen. So again, I think the point is, after you do this, how you bring more sort of communication and education to the public is also quite important. Okay, I think this is my last slide. I think it's sort of transformation after 10 years, the transformation process, I would say just started and still very much evolving. Again, I think these are the four key factors, I would say, important: the vision, the execution capacity, the role of integrated planning into the whole process, and how things are coordinated across different agencies and cities. I'm sorry, I probably couldn't cover some of these points because of the time limit. I hope this brief presentation give you a some broad views of how things were planned, started, and evolved, in the past 10 years. So I hope that's a helpful discussion. So thanks once again. I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Jerry. It was a very informative from the flood management strategy of divert, retain, and discharge, and how the projects have been evolved from that and actually is being implemented. That was very informative. And thanks a lot for doing this presentation. Now we move on to the third topic. Dr. Harikumar will be presenting the topic on landslide risk reduction through planning and regulations, case study of ISWA. Dr. Harikumar is a civil engineer with over 34 years of experience, of which the last 18 years he has been focused on disaster risk mitigation. He has a PhD from IIS EST Calcutta, and his research was on strategic role of mitigation planning for earthquake and landslide prone Indian hill towns. He is the South Asia Regional Coordinator of Geohazards International and also heads the Geohazard Society India. His main focus areas are earthquake and landslide risk mitigation, safety and educational, health facilities, and urban risk reduction. He was involved in various earthquake safety projects, including hospital retrofitting, assessment of hospitals and schools in India, Bhutan, Nepal, and Myanmar. Today, he will be presenting the landslide risk reduction of Aizawl Municipal Corporation, mainly on the policy framework. Over to Dr. Harikumar. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajesh ji. I hope you can see my screen.
It's audible and we can see.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, very, very interesting topics we are covering, and very interesting to hear both Paul and Jerry and the case studies. And actually going to talk about an unlikely candidate for a risk reduction. This is in the northeastern part of India, Aizawl, and to find out where Aizawl is normally, almost beyond Bangladesh and almost in Myanmar. Mizoram is a state which has more international boundaries than connection with the rest of India, because on one side it's completely bounded by Myanmar and the other side by Bangladesh. And Aizawl is the capital city of the state of Mizoram, and it's a ridgetop city. It is actually not a city which grew around water. Normally habitations grow around water, but this is a complete paradox in the sense that it grew about 120 years back. It started off as a settlement around a military camp on the top of a ridge. So water was pretty far away, even in those days. So it's the ridgetop city, and as you can see here, this town in the last 30-35 years has grown to every inch possible. If there are spots in this photograph where there is no building, that means it is a cliff, a vertical cliff. If that was possible, they would have built on it. And this, for me, is the embodiment of risk. And the buildings which we saw are really not your normal 2-storied, 3-storied buildings. These are 8+, maybe 12-storied buildings, as you can see in most of these in the photo you can see. Most of these buildings are 8 to 12 storied buildings. And the way they construct, I mean, if you have a plot in the middle of this, there's no space actually. But if you plan to construct a building in this city, you probably end up cutting down somebody else's foundation. This is how a site we observed recently, and this used to be really common when we went to Aizawl. So here you can see actually the foundation of the house above is lying, below has been cut, and this person possibly has not applied for a building permit because if you apply for a building permit, you are supposed to bring in a geologist report and all that. So what people used to do in Aizawl was that they would cut first and then apply. By the time the damage is done, the damage above the building is done, the damage below the site is done. And the interesting thing is that the person above will probably have no problem with this because he himself has cut the foundation of the house above him while he was constructing. So it is pretty normal practice to finally patch it all up, and no one will be the wiser once this building has come up. But these kind of comorbidities, as I call them, are going to be exposed in the next earthquake or the next climate event. They are going to be exposed, and it's very, very important for us to understand the effects of future hazards on these unregulated development. So Aizawl actually started, taking this seriously in about 2014, and this was actually triggered by two events. One was a scenario of an earthquake, a scientific study of what would happen if an earthquake struck Aizawl was conducted, and there was a study looking at what would happen to the hills around Aizawl, what would happen to the roads connecting Aizawl to the rest of the country. And as I mentioned earlier, Mizoram is hanging on to India. Actually, it's a very small portion connecting it with the rest of India. So there are only two roads connecting Aizawl or Mizoram to the rest of the country, one to Assam and one to Manipur. Recently, a third road has been included towards Tripura. So these two roads are prone to landslides. As you would have seen in many videos going around recently, it is the roads which are creating the landslides. And so these unregulated slope modifications are creating the landslides. And in the scenario, it was found that these roads will not be available for any rescue or relief operations because they are going to be blocked by earthquake triggered landslides. So that was one event which triggered some action from the government of Mizoram. The second aspect was an actual landslide during the monsoon season, which killed 18 people, and it was in the heart of Aizawl. And so these two, one incident and one activity coincided, and there was a sort of a window of opportunity provided by the loss of life in the landslide. So the policy side actually took over, and there was a lot of interest within the government to reduce the risk due to landslides. So the scenario actually studied the effects of the earthquake and the induced landslide on each of the critical systems, whether it be a water supply system or the health facilities or the roads. And they could use this window of opportunity provided by the landslide. And the study, though it was about the earthquake effects, what came out and what was revealing was that it was landslides which were the main problem, the triggered landslides. And it was determined that 1,100 landslides would happen within the municipal area in a dry season earthquake, triggered landslides. And the government was, adept at handling landslides, but when they come one at a time, not when they happen, 1,000 landslides at the same time. So there was a need, there was a desire to do something about landslide risk mitigation. And the other effects of landslide were also very stark, that the power grid fails because of many landslides along the transmission lines. The water supply system, like I mentioned earlier, Aizaol's water supply system is dependent on one line from the river, and it's a 8 kilometers water supply line pumped up the hill. So 8 kilometers of water supply line passing through 3 active landslides. So, in an earthquake, one, the power is failing. Two, some of the water supply lines are going to be affected by landslides. And the connecting roads and the internal roads both are affected by landslides and bridge collapses. Health facilities, the main civil hospital is actually built on a landslide. So part of it is to be affected by landslides. That was the study's finding. And communication also, the communication towers would be lost, basically due to loss of power, but also some of these towers being affected by the landslides. So there were detailed recommendations for each sector. The high-level recommendations actually were all landslide focused, which actually helped the cause of landslide risk reduction. One, for the roads, it was that we engineer one road connecting Aizawl to either Silchar or to Manipur to make sure that all the landslides are assessed and mitigated. At least one road will be secure after a major earthquake. Also, the other aspect was the airport road. The airport is about 34 kilometers away from the city, and it passes through 2 active landslides, and there was a bad bridge which was expected to collapse. So actually, this city, which actually is about 400,000 people, would be without electricity, without water, without any connections to the rest of the country, and without communications. In the time when this study was conducted in 2013-14, the government of Mizoram did not even have a satellite phone. So, when the earthquake struck in Kathmandu, the Indian help was there within a couple of hours at Kathmandu airport. But in the case of Aizawl, the government of India would not even know, Delhi would not even know what had happened because communications would have failed. And there was no road connectivity. The airport, even if it survives, would not be connected to the population center in Aizawl. So it took, this study took, set of seismologists, the structural engineers, the landslide geologists, urban planners, public policy specialists, the specialists of infrastructure, road engineers, and disaster managers, all to come together to understand what would happen to each sector. And this is also, disaster risk reduction. Again, we will have to break the silos, and all of these sectors will have to start working together if risk reduction has to be possible. And Aizawl actually got them to be working together. The Aizawl Municipal Corporation took, great steps. I think the first one they did was to form a landslide policy committee. This landslide policy committee had all the sectors which I had mentioned earlier. They brought them together into one committee to work together to work towards the safety of Aizawl against landslides. And this committee actually worked for several months actually to develop what they called a roadmap to stability. It was actually a long-term risk mitigation plans they created for the municipality of Aizawl. And then, and one of the aspects which they found early enough is that if we have to do any kind of landslide risk mitigation, the maps which we have right now, 1:50,000 scale, are not enough. We have to get better maps. So they actually set their time for developing 1:1000 scale landslide hazard maps, and then upgraded to 1:5000. And their dream is to have 1:1000 scale maps. Right now, I mean, as I speak today, they have a 1:5000 scale landslide hazard map for the municipal area. They also had to actually, as most of the landslides in Aizawl were human-induced, they had to regulate how man interferes with the slopes. So they actually brought out a new regulation for slope modification. We'll talk about that in subsequent slides. Regulations to control cutting and filling within the municipal areas. And they also realized that they cannot depend on the Department of Geology and Mines for conducting site inspection of every building application they received. They needed to have their own staff members. So Aizawl became the first municipality in the country to create a position for geologists. And also they empaneled 90 geologists and geotechnical engineers. Because, I mean, if a city like Shimla or Gangtok is doing without geologists, there is a problem. And that is why we are having landslides in these areas. So a civil engineer, a good civil engineer, can do only so much about building safety. I mean, he cannot be a replacement for a geologist or a geotechnical engineer. So the Aizawl's Landslide Policy Committee, as I mentioned earlier, the breaking silos, they brought together, Public Works Department, the PHED, the Land Revenue Department, the Disaster Management Department, MIRSAC, the remote sensing folks, the Geology and Mines people. The Mizoram University and their geology department was brought into the picture, and Aizawl Municipal Corporation. And their maps, the maps they prepared. Actually, here's the presentation of the Landslide Policy Committee, where the maps are being presented, and the NDMA representative, the National Disaster Management Authority representative, is also was present when the maps were handed over to the maps committee, handed it over to the Landslide Policy Committee. So this, the roadmap to stability, as I mentioned earlier, this was the long-term risk reduction plan for Aizawl. And this is actually from their own website, the AMC Mizoram's website itself. This actually laid out the steps Aizawl has to take in actually, on the policy side, on the capacity side, all the steps they had to do on developing the maps, all the steps they had to do were laid out in the roadmap to stability. It was brought out in 2014, and the Landslide Policy Committee actually meets periodically to review how much of the roadmap has been achieved and what more is left to achieve, actually. And some of the steps, I'm just giving a few highlights. One of the plans was to adopt rules that require a permit for all excavation or filling involving more than 10 cubic meters. Earlier, no one could stop me if I was a parcel owner from cutting. If I did not apply for a building permit, I could cut all I wanted. I could endanger the buildings above. I could endanger the slope. I could create a landslide. They couldn't question me. Now they have new rules for that require a permit and a geological inspection, and require that the excavated soil be disposed. Earlier, it would just be pushing the excavated soil onto the slope below, creating trouble for the parcel owners below, and also blocking drainage. So now the excavated soil or rock has to be disposed of ice outside the city. And they talked about a 5-year capital outlay for for drainage, actually, essentially for drainage, and also prepare maps at a scale of 1:8,000 for the AMC area. They did better than that. They now have maps of 1:5,000. And the landslide hazard maps were actually done by a subcommittee of the Landslide Policy Committee, where MIRSAC and Mizoram University Department of Geology and Mines and the Disaster Management Department got together. At first, they developed the 1:10,000, and now the 1:5,000 was submitted and approved by the Landslide Policy Committee. And these maps were really important. I mean, on the one side, they are developing regulations that don't allow cutting in certain zones. You need these maps. So the maps they were working on the regulations, and they were also working on appointing geologists who can actually enforce those regulations. So this is one tile of the Aizawl landslide hazard map. There are 121 tiles of the landslide hazard map, quite detailed. This is 1:5,000. And now they actually, there is going to be a landslide policy committee meeting on Friday, the coming Friday. I am actually speaking from Aizawl. I actually come to for a workshop on revisiting the scenario, and also attending the landslide policy committee, where they are going to be aiming for the 1:2,000 scale maps. The slope modification, the site development and slope modification regulations, as they are called, was brought out in 2017. And I'm again giving you a few highlights of how the slope modification. It's a 26-page document. Has I mean, they consider protection of adjacent property, and requirements for all applications. It is not just private individuals who have to abide by these slope modification regulations. Every government department except the Defense Ministry, which has rights to do cutting for emergencies. Every other department is supposed to get permits and do. It is all departments are equal under these regulations, and there are restrictions for any building activity, any development activity during the monsoons. So actually, in a couple of days, the development activities in Aizawl will stop for 2.5 months. That is what has been notified day before yesterday. So they actually stopped the cutting during the monsoon season. And notification for adjacent plot owners, how the cuts and excavations have to be managed in the high risk zones and the moderate risk zones and the low risk zones. There are different categories of how they have to be monitored, and also similarly for fills and for filling the slope, how it can be done, who will be eligible to monitor. It's all laid out in the Mizoram slope modification regulations. Also looking at erosion control, disposal of excavated materials, a really path-breaking regulation, which actually, NDMA cited as the National Disaster Management Authority cited this, and it's an example for other hill cities to look at. But it's really a robust work going on in this small city, and their long-term actions actually was triggered by this landslide, the Laiputlang landslide, which killed 18 people. They created those two geologists, and it was not easy. I mean, creating a government post, we all understand how long it takes. It took them 3 years to create those two positions, and they realized that it is better to empanel geologists. So they have empaneled geologists and who have a certain criteria to be met before they can be empaneled, and they're given certain trainings so that they all actually are on the same page. They're planning for 1:1000 scale maps by 2023. And in all of this, it's very, very important to garner the public's support. Without the support of the public, it will not be possible. And it has been a hard grind for the officials of the Aizawl Municipal Corporation. And they use every opportunity, any landslide and which happens in the vicinity or even in another state, they will be using those opportunities to inform the public about the importance of these regulations. Long-term action planning has really been the key, and it's really important for all our hill towns. And regulations are an important first step when we want to control haphazard development. I mean, I'm just giving an example of how unregulated slope modification can create landslides. This is from our own Kerala, where you will see the government Munnar, one of the largest landslides which happened during the 2018 floods. And if you look at the picture on the extreme left, it's 2017, before anything happened. The government college constructions was on, of course, destabilizing the slope, but then the road widening below the NH 85 widening actually really did a lot of damage, and also filling, pushing the cut earth onto the slopes was another triggering factor, which we saw in 2018 during the floods. One of the largest landslides took away the college, the road, and it almost reached almost blocked the river below. So the unregulated slope modifications, have to be controlled, and which is where the Aizawl regulations that actually even the government will have to take precautions, have to take permits and get the geological checks and balances done, would have regulated landslides like these. Landslide mitigation, there are several options. If the landslide has already occurred or is likely to occur, there are several options, but I would vote for avoiding. Let us avoid creating landslides. Let us focus on, integrating the risk information into regulations to reduce the landslides from happening. Let us avoid. And avoidance by regulations will be to bring in the codal references into the building regulations, both in the hilly areas. Get better hazard maps. I mean, most of our hill towns across the country have 1:50,000 scale maps, which may not be enough for planners. You really need to understand our hazard better, our risk better. And again, adopt rules that require permit for all site development and slope modification, and especially the high hazard areas to submit geological report to the local bodies and have the geologists identified previously. I mean, it cannot be just we are telling the house owner you get a geologist report done, and they have to try to find geologists to somehow give them a report. Also about disposal of the excavated soil and rock to be outside areas which will not create landslides. And also controlling surface runoff and drainage planning. And like I mentioned earlier, appoint or impanel geologists. Aizawl may have looked like this about 30 years back. 30 years back, I mean, all the development in Aizawl happened in, it's about 30-35 years of development. Just a city which sprung up while nobody was looking almost. And it could have looked like this. And this is Kerala. And, many of our hilly areas could begin to look like Aizawl if we are not careful, if we don't regulate well enough. So let us understand risk. Let us regulate today. Let us avoid risk, and let us avoid the disasters of tomorrow. Thank you so much. I always like this saying that the best fights are the ones we should avoid. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harikumar. Actually, the policy level interventions was really interesting. We actually, while we are preparing the draft building rules for Munnar area, we actually took the notification, some of the points that has been deliberated in that notification. Thanks a lot for a good presentation. We have one question: how the landslide policy committee associated with SDMA or DDMA in government of Mizoram?
SDMA was a part of the landslide policy committee itself. Actually, SDMA directed the municipal corporation to form this policy committee, and they were a member. In Mizoram, the SDMA, actually it is still called the Department of Disaster Management. So they are a member of the landslide policy committee itself.
So once the hazard map is prepared, actually, is there any vetting is being done on the technical aspect of that?
The vetting was done actually by the government themselves. Actually, they did on-site verification in several locations within Aizawl itself. And actually, after 3 years of these hazard maps, now the newly appointed geologists are actually finding a few mistakes, which is very good news, because that means they are using it. They are using it, which is why they are asking for 1:1,000 to avoid such errors.
So once again, thank you, Harikumar. Now we go on to the next presentation on integrating of hazard mitigation planning in a comprehensive plan of US cities and its regions. Over to Mr. B.R. Balachandran. Balachandran is an urban planner and international development consultant with over 30 years of experience. He was involved in preparation of the development plan and town planning schemes, land readjustment for rebuilding the city of Bhuj, Gujarat after the 2001 Gujarat earthquake. Balachandran has provided consultancy services on international projects in Mexico, Cuba, Palestine, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, Mauritius, and Indonesia. Most recently, he has been involved in providing advisory services in resilience, post-disaster recovery, affordable housing policy, and sustainable urban development. He is currently working with as a short-term consultant and advisor to World Bank and KfW in institutional reforms as a part of Kerala Rebuild initiative. He will outline the legal, institutional, and policy framework in the US for mitigating disaster risk. He will illustrate how comprehensive plans at the local and regional level to integrate the risk reduction policies emerging from this framework. He'll also mention the major challenges faced by this system and the relevance of this system with the Kerala. Thank you. Over to Mr. B.R. Balachandran. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajesh. Thank you for the opportunity to share my understanding of how the system works in the US, of hazard mitigation planning and how that gets integrated into local comprehensive planning in US cities and regions. I have divided the presentation into these 4 parts. First, I'll briefly outline the legal, institutional, and policy framework at the federal and state levels and how that influences the way this process unfolds. Then I'll use one example to illustrate how hazard mitigation planning is integrated into local comprehensive planning. In the third section, I'll briefly mention some challenges that the US system is facing and that we should be aware of when we look at adapting useful elements from that to the Kerala context. And finally, I'll close with my personal opinions on what we can use from the US context from the US system in the Kerala context. My presentation is brief, so we will still finish this webinar on time with some time to discuss as well. Let me start with the legal, institutional, and policy framework. Now, some elements of this institutional system are common for all hazards, but some are hazard specific, and therefore I have chosen to take flooding as an example to talk about how the whole system works. So the legislative framework for managing disasters and reducing disaster risk has been evolving in the US for a very long time, starting with the legislative response to a fire in New Hampshire in 1803. So it has been evolving for over 200 years. A landmark legislation in this space was the Stafford Act of 1988, which put in place the currently existing system where a presidential disaster declaration or an emergency declaration triggers financial and physical assistance through the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. The Stafford Act was amended in the year 2000 by the Disaster Mitigation Act, and this one put in place a framework for state, local, tribal, and territorial governments to engage in hazard mitigation planning with non-emergency disaster assistance. So this was a step forward to reducing disaster risk and not just responding to disasters and recovering from disasters after them. In the space of flood hazard mitigation, the important legislations started with the National Flood Insurance Act 1968, under which created the National Flood Insurance Program. And that's a very, very important program when it comes to reducing flood risk and also compensating people in the event of floods. This was modified by the Flood Disaster Protection Act of 1973, which one of the important aspects of that was that it made insurance mandatory in special flood hazard areas, or SFHAs. And then in 2012, the Bigger Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act of 2012 enabled the government to calibrate insurance premiums to reflect the true risk of living in high flood areas. Now, this is only a very brief overview of the legislative framework. It's actually a much more detailed, complex system which evolves continuously through legislative interventions. The Federal Emergency Management Agency plays a very, very important role in the way this whole system operates. FEMA provides assistance to state, county, and local governments and to individuals and households. This is done before, during, and after disasters, and the assistance goes to mitigate hazards, evacuate and take shelter during disasters, and also to recover from disasters by repairing, rebuilding, or relocating. Now, FEMA operates several federal programs, for example, the National Flood Insurance Program, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program, Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, and the Individuals and Households Assistance Program. Now, FEMA is also responsible for producing flood insurance rate maps, or FIRMs as they're called, and they delineate special flood hazard areas. And these are very important threat and risk assessments and there are several others too in the US system of mitigating risk. So this is an example of a firm map produced for the city of New Orleans. Many of you might remember that the city of New Orleans was severely impacted by Hurricane Katrina and remained flooded for many days. And this is a city which was built in a place which was illogical from a flooding point of view. It is below sea level, and it is protected by levee systems, and the levees failed in 2005, and that's how the city got flooded. Now, these kind of maps, they show the 100-year floodplain. I won't get into the technicalities. You have already listened to Paul's presentation on the technical aspects of this. But it's important to note that if a certain area is protected notionally, at least effectively, by flood protection systems that is considered developable, and so the people will get insurance in those areas, though now the insurance premium might be calibrated to the actual level of risk. Now, these kind of maps are not static. They keep getting revised. They are not all of the same level of detail or quality or accuracy in all the cities in the US. Many cities update more frequently. Many states take initiative to update the maps more frequently. And when an updating is going on, then you have an effective firm map, which is used for regulating and to determine insurance premiums. But there will also be a preliminary firm that gives stakeholders a sense of what the future firm map is going to look like. So all this information usually is in the public domain, and people can understand how risk is changing in almost in real time, so to say. Now, states also undertake a lot of risk assessments and strategic interventions to reduce risk. To give you one example that I am familiar with, because Louisiana is where I did my doctoral research. So the Mississippi Delta has been facing a lot of land loss. That whole region has lost 2,000 square miles in less than a century. So they have been facing flood risk and land loss and subsidence for a long time. And there have been a lot of initiatives to deal with this, and landmark legislation in that respect came about in 1990 with the Coastal Wetlands Planning, Protection and Restoration Act, which provided several state agencies with the legal mandate and the funding required to undertake restoration and protection. But following Hurricane Katrina, and 1 month after that, Hurricane Rita, which impacted, Hurricane Katrina impacted the city of New Orleans, and Hurricane Rita devastated a large portion of the Deltaic region. The state government then decided that no, we need a more aggressive way to aggressive approach to deal with it. So they merged multiple agencies together and created the Louisiana Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, or CPRA. And this agency has been mandated with the preparation of the Coastal Master Plan. The first one was done in 2007. Then every 5 years they've been revising it. The second was in 2012, then in 2017, and COVID has delayed the next one, but it's expected to come out in 2023. The work is going on. Now, a tremendous amount of technical expertise goes into the modeling and the modeling of what is likely to happen in a changing climate scenario in this region, and also to figure out what sort of interventions are feasible and how those what effect those interventions will have in terms of risk reduction. The CPRA also is well funded. So the 2017 plan, for instance, has a proposed $50 billion investment. And this is justified because that region, South Louisiana region, is economically very important, not just for the state of Louisiana, but for the entire country. So this is an example of how states also engage with legal, institutional and policy frameworks to reduce risk. So I've tried to capture the essential elements of how this framework operates. So as I described just now, at the federal and state level, there is legislation which mandates the creation of agencies and programs, and the legislation also creates conditions for participation by local jurisdictions. Now, when the system goes into program implementation, it generates risk information, like the firm maps that I gave as an example. It provides financial and technical assistance for hazard mitigation planning to participating jurisdictions. And it helps calibrate insurance premium based on a rating system. In the case of floods, it is called the community rating system. So participating communities, their objective is to improve their rating in the rating system so that the insurance premiums for properties within their jurisdiction comes down. So it's an incentive-based mechanism. And then you come to the actual planning. So the system requires that communities, cities, counties, and regions prepare hazard mitigation plans if they want to participate in the whole program. Once those hazard mitigation plans are prepared, then the jurisdiction, whether it is a community, a city, or a county, they integrate the hazard mitigation proposals into all their plans. So let's take a closer look at that part, which is integrating hazard mitigation in local planning. So I'm giving the example of the city of New Orleans, and very recently, last year, they revised their hazard mitigation plan. There was an earlier version which they built upon, and this hazard mitigation plan goes deep into risk assessment for multiple hazards, including land subsidence, flooding, coastal erosion, storm surges, flooding caused by storm surges and the impact of the storm surge itself, hurricanes, which includes wind hazard and the flooding caused by the high precipitation during that period. So all these risks are assessed. They use all available sources of information. Whatever FEMA has produced, they use that. The local, in the case of Louisiana, I mentioned that there is an agency called CPRA, which does very rigorous modeling. So that information is used. So that's the risk assessment part. Then they also do a capability assessment. As part of that, there are many aspects of capability assessment, but what's important here is that when the hazard mitigation plan is prepared, they review all existing plans. So in the case of the city of New Orleans, the comprehensive master plan of the city was reviewed, and all the capital improvement programs and infrastructure development projects, all of those were reviewed to see to what extent hazard mitigation is already considered or integrated into those plans. And then the hazard mitigation plan proposes mitigation strategies. These strategies then inform the next generation of plans. So it's a cycle. So you make the hazard mitigation plan that proposes a set of interventions. It may include action plans like projects and programs for reducing risk. Now, once that plan is done, when the next round of comprehensive planning is done, whatever is in the hazard mitigation plan is considered in the comprehensive plan. So the city of New Orleans in 2010 prepared its master plan. And at that time, whatever hazard mitigation plan was available and whatever that hazard mitigation plan proposed was integrated into the master plan. Now, this was, I think, updated into 2016 and 2018. Now that the 2021 hazard mitigation plan is available, in the next revision of this master plan, they will integrate whatever has already been proposed in the hazard mitigation plan. So there are proposals for hazard mitigation projects, which include building levees, pump systems, and other structural interventions. Now, Paul mentioned that these kind of interventions, physical, structural interventions to protect already developed areas from floods should not be considered as urban planning interventions. And I agree with that. But in the US system, if it makes economic sense to invest in structural protection measures to protect an existing area, then that is very much considered part of the urban planning process. So the comprehensive plan for New Orleans doesn't just have a land use plan and regulations. It does have that, but it also translates all its strategies into specific actions. They clearly outline what is the action required, how is it to be done, who, meaning which agency is responsible for it, by when it is to be completed, and where are the resources going to come from. So in a sense, the comprehensive plan or the master plan is not just a wish list or even a statement of intention. It actually thinks through the implementation process and lays it out so that it's easy for the concerned agencies to then take up each of these actions for implementation. So in terms of land use zoning, the land use zones respect flood risk. For example, natural areas are designated for non-structural flood mitigation, similar to examples we have seen so far. The building codes are calibrated to the assessed risk. For example, buildings have to be elevated above the, raised above the base flood elevation. Since this area is very prone to hurricanes, the buildings have to be strengthened for wind hazard. There are many layers of complication to this. For example, if you raise a building to reduce its exposure to flood, then you're increasing exposure to wind. So then a new level of regulation, building code would kick in for strengthening the building against wind hazard. Now, the American Planning Association and FEMA have been working together to produce a lot of tools for planners to figure out what needs to be done to integrate hazard mitigation planning into local comprehensive planning. So one of the tools is called the Safe Growth Integration Tool. It's essentially a matrix to assess where the city stands in terms of integrating hazard mitigation into the planning framework. So on the left, you will see the different aspects of hazard mitigation, which include risk assessment, establishing mitigation goals and objectives, and listing out mitigation actions under various categories. And on the columns, you will see the elements of the planning framework, starting with comprehensive or general plan elements, then zoning ordinances and development regulations. In the Kerala context, that they're part of the same thing. Then capital improvement in infrastructure programs, and continuing with area level plans and functional plans like stormwater or economic development plans or open space plans. And then you have special programs like transfer of development rights and tax increment financing districts, and the public and stakeholder engagement process. So in all these areas of the planning framework, this matrix helps the city to check whether hazard mitigation has already been taken care of. In this example, those are marked with the tick mark, the check mark, and where there is that red star, those are the areas which have been identified as a gap between mitigation plan and planning framework. So having the mitigation plan done beforehand is very helpful for the planners who are working on the comprehensive plan or the master plan, because you already know what hazard risks you're dealing with and what needs to be done to mitigate those, and then the planners can focus on the main urban planning framework elements and see what's missing and what needs to be addressed. So I'm not trying to sell the US system to Kerala. The US system has its own set of challenges. Let me mention a few of them. So there are problems with the insurance system. There are thousands of repetitive loss properties. Having the flood insurance in some cases has encouraged people to build in hazardous locations, and there's lots of literature on this that you can see, where specific properties have claimed compensation multiple times. So a house gets destroyed in a flood, you take the insurance amount, rebuild it, and it comes another hurricane or a flood and it gets destroyed again, you again claim money and you build it again. So that sort of system creates a moral hazard in the insurance terminology. So that's one issue. And because of this and other issues, hazard mitigation interventions are not enough to reduce insurance payouts. So the whole framework is meant to incentivize cities, communities, and individuals and households to undertake hazard mitigation interventions so that the effective risk is reduced, so that the insurance system wouldn't have to pay out. But these have not yet caught up with the requirement. And therefore, the National Flood Insurance Program payout is much higher than its revenues, causing the system to run up billions of dollars in debt. So the federal government has written off some of that debt, but even now there is billions of dollars. The system is billions of dollars in the red. There are also issues of equity within the insurance system. It doesn't really take care of the vulnerabilities of low income and otherwise disadvantaged populations. Now they are working on an improvement called Risk Rating 2.0, which seeks to address many of the above issues. It hasn't fully rolled out yet, so we don't know how good it is in addressing the problems. There are also issues of equity and justice. Many socially and economically disadvantaged communities live in highly risk-prone locations due to historical factors. This is not unique to the US by any means. It is true across the world. It is true all over India. It is true in Kerala too. And because they live in these highly risk-prone locations, when the jurisdiction comes up with land use zoning, building codes, and insurance premiums that are calibrated to hazard risk without considering socioeconomic factors, it can increase the vulnerability or even displace people of that in that category. And another thing that happens is in places like South Louisiana, cohesive traditional communities get scattered, and in the process they lose the social capital that they have by living close to each other. So that there are these kind of issues that are coming up. Now, looking at what we can use from the US system in the Kerala context, first of all, the overall framework. So the legal, institutional, and policy regimes at the federal and state level, I think there is much to learn from that for use in Kerala at the state level. The mandates and incentives for hazard mitigation planning at the district, city, town, or village level, that's something we can look at in the Kerala context. Just now we have not really considered hazard mitigation plans for cities as a separate exercise, but I think it's worth looking at. And mechanisms for integrating hazard mitigation into comprehensive plans or master plans. I think the methodologies used in the US, the guidance documents created by FEMA and APA can be a good source for adaptation to the Kerala context, considering Kerala's specific development characteristics and planning system and the kind of decentralization that we have in our governance system. Risk assessment and mapping. Now, as I mentioned earlier, FEMA's flood risk maps are always a work in progress, and I think there is something to learn from that. We can start with available information. We must transparently declare the limitations of the data that we have, and work with those, and then systematically improve them over time. Now, that process of improving the quality and accuracy of risk information, it requires collaboration between multiple stakeholders. Of late, even the US system has now, it's moving out of the mold of technical rationality, and it is the system is now more willing to engage with people and use data from the lived experience of risk, and incorporate that information in hazard mitigation planning. And I think Kerala is already way ahead in terms of using public participation to generate risk information. But we could look at the US system and the examples from Europe, like the one that Paul showed, to figure out how we can build a database and continuously improve on it. And another point I wanted to make is that hazards do not respect jurisdictional boundaries, and therefore risk assessment and mitigation planning must be done at multiple levels, and collaboration across jurisdictional boundaries is critical for successful mitigation. This happens not through usually not through a legally mandated process in the US. It is through active collaboration between different levels of jurisdiction and going across boundaries. Finally, the last point I want to make is that equity and justice considerations must be in the foreground, because the risk in getting very technical about this whole thing is that when you create restrictive land use zoning and stringent building codes, that can actually, in effect, increase the vulnerability of disadvantaged families or even displace them, unless we look at support for vulnerable families as an essential component of hazard mitigation planning. So that's probably a good starting point to work towards reducing risk. With that, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Balakrishnan. We have got a real good overview of what is happening in US and how the systems are working there for preparation of hazard maps and integrating that information into the master plan process, and also the framework and the policy that is being associated with respect to that. There is one question with respect to what is the scale of map, that hazard map that is being prepared for using for risk assessment and all that, and also whether it is based on the past events or it's also simulation has been done.
So as I was mentioning, there is considerable variation across the US in terms of the level of detail, accuracy, and quality of risk assessment and mapping that is done. But by and large, all cities have maps that are 1:5,000 or better in scale. And sorry.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, so they are very detailed and high resolution maps, and it is the with respect to whether it uses only historical data. No, they also do modeling, and FEMA sources its information from multiple agencies. Whoever has the best level of detail, they use that. So in a region like Louisiana, for example, the National Oceanic Administration Agency, NOAA, will also play a role because they measure sea level rise and coastal processes. So they source whatever is the best available data, and they also commission a lot of fresh studies in high-risk areas. So there is historical data, there is modeling and forecasting of all sorts happening.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Balachandran, for this very good presentation. And now we are coming to the last session of this presentation. For the concluding remarks, I actually invite Dr. Joy Element. Dr. Joy Element is an MBBS doctor by profession and has a master's degree in public health. He has been awarded Outstanding Community Builder Award by the UNDP India Solution Exchange in 2007 and is a core member of Technical Advisor for the South Asia Climate Proofing and Growth Development, CPGD, Climate Change Innovation Program. Since 2017, he is the Director General of KILA. His area of expertise includes decentralization and local governance, capacity development, participatory planning, monitoring and evaluation, especially in the context of local economic development and gender, anti-poverty program development through women's self-help groups and local governments, etc. This Rebuild Kerala Initiative program has a lot of disbursement indicators with respect to that. And that two indicators are basically on the LSG side, DLI 4 and 5. And the nodal officer for these two DLIs is Dr. Joy Element. Over to Joy sir for his concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you all for this very informative, enlightening webinar. Inputs coming from all parts of the globe, I would say. We started with Madam Sharada Muralidharan, who actually talked about the role of local governments in disaster management. Also, she dealt with the evolution of disaster management plan by local governments, and at the moment talking also about the climate resilient, disaster risk reduced planning, which should be an integral part of the master plans. So the expectation is about a paradigm shift in master planning process. So that is why we are also into the process of developing risk-informed master plan guidelines to be used by the local governments, not only the urban local governments. In future, this has to be the way for the rural local governments also. But as she also mentioned, it's a trial and error method. You do it and then you correct it and go, because we need to actually try out how things happen at the local level. But more than that, the need for risk information to be provided to the community is also important. Dr. Paul from Serima talked about the flood risk prevention, and the example provided is definitely very important for us, as we have been into the management of floods. Unparalleled floods in the 2018 and regular floods every year, kind of in many parts of the state. So naturally, when we are talking about integration of risk in land use planning, we also have to look at the flood risk prevention plan also. And I was also happy to see understand a few of these examples, like the national compensation system, which is also integrated with the risk-informed integrated urban planning. And then also the way he has mentioned about the risk intersection between hazard and the states, the territories and other things. So the hazard map preparation, which also has been mentioned. Why I am talking about all these things or coming back with all these things is that these are all lessons for us sitting here in Kerala. And especially the hydraulic simulation for different time periods. That's also very important whenever we are talking about risk-informed master plan and all. We need to have that simulations and see how it works. Jerry talks about the transformation of Colombo, especially within the 10 years. Usually what happens is that changes do not happen fast, but within 10 years, how the city of Colombo matured into a world-class metropolitan, which actually involves the need for a grand visionary or a vision for future and strong execution capacity. It's not only the vision and planning, but execution capacity after the vision and plan, and integrating planning into the local level, very local level, grassroots level designing. And there is also the issue of convergence, the way the terminology used was the close institutional and across ministry collaboration, but I would say it's also about the convergence aspect of it. Dr. Harikumar talked about the Mizoram, where the earthquakes and the landslides are a daily affair, or I would say a regular affair, and how various studies on water supply, power grid failure, communication interruption, lack of health facility, and road network connectivity interruption. All these things are part and parcel of most of these land-related or water-related hazards or disasters, and how one needs to tackle it, starting from the scratch. Many a time, many of our cities and towns, they have to start from very, very grassroots level or very minimum level. And there also the importance of long-term planning was highlighted. And finally, it was our friend Balachandran who explained to us the integration of hazard mitigation planning in comprehensive planning, US cities and regions, where he dealt with legal, institutional, policy framework at various levels, and also mentioned about an example of integrating hazard mitigation in local planning, which is very important for us for our present initiative in risk-informed master planning. Definitely, he mentioned about the challenges. That's also important. Whenever we actually come up with case studies and his case stories, we only highlight the achievements and the good part of it. But for anyone venturing into a similar exercise, naturally, the challenges faced, the failures happened, which are all of importance, so that we don't make the mistake again and again. So, being from Kerala, I can tell like that, I hope, Balachandran. So, being from Kerala, the relevance of his presentation in the Kerala context, so he could actually make that connection so that it's of great use to all of us here looking into risk-informed planning. Finally, in the earlier times, we had to do something with whatever is known to us. Whereas in the present day context, we have opportunities to learn from others who have done similar exercise or better exercise across the globe. And with the knowledge sharing networks available, we are able to learn from others so that Rajesh and team finds it easier. They don't have to reinvent the wheel. Many of the inputs are already there. In fact, these 2.5 hours of webinar provided a lot of inputs for finalizing our guidelines for master planning. Not only the guidelines, how to do it, the challenges, and the various examples which will be of great use to us. Of course, this is also a good opportunity. Dr. Shekhar was also there. So this is also a good opportunity for all of us working our local self-government department planning, the Kerala State Disaster Management Authority with Dr. Shekhar, and our own team in Kila. All of us together are working with so many others to make Kerala a resilient community, especially with the experiences we had with the 2018 floods and the things which happened later. We are also into the process of rebuilding our Kerala, and where risk-informed master planning becomes very essential. It's not only about the disaster, it's also not about disaster management when a disaster strikes, but it is also about disaster risk reduction, disaster mitigation, and these are all in the context of climate change, where we are again a target for the climate change also. Even though we are a small province in a corner of India, we have been targeted by the climate change problems also, where we also need to address that. So it's also about climate actions or climate change actions, as well as disaster risk reduction actions, mitigation, and all, of course, the adaptation, where the local plans which we prepare for development by the local governments become handy. Those have to be used for actual implementation post the master plan. And there we need to have this master plan, an agile planning process, which has to be a dynamic process. It's not a stagnant, once a lifetime kind of thing, but we need to learn and move ahead and ahead. So with these words, I conclude my note here. Thank you all for this very informative session, which would be of very great use to us, not only in the preparation of the guidelines for urban master plans, which will also be useful for our overall development planning, and also for the governance and for the legislative efforts. So thank you all once again. Thank you, Rajesh and team, for organizing this on behalf of our P4R program. And thank you all. Thanks.
Thank you, Joy, sir, for a wonderful concluding remarks. I thank all the participants who have joined this webinar. We had at one time 96 participants. It was a great success. And the information passed on was really relevant in the case of our study and preparation of guidelines. And thank you all.